let's take a couple shonen MCs and turn them into JJK characters. Who would be the most effective sorcerer? We've done this with Hunter x Hunter, we've done this with My Hero Academia, and now Jujutsu Kaisen. We'll look at a couple iconic characters and analyze them, seeing how well they'd perform as a sorcerer and more importantly, what abilities they might have if we translated them to curse techniques. We also want to see how useful their abilities are in a verse like this. Here's the roster we have, with a slightly different selection than the last two videos, as well as a few extra characters. Goku from Dragon Ball, Fuuko from Undead Unluck, Gon from Hunter x Hunter with Killua as a bonus, Luffy from One Piece with Zoro as a bonus, Baki from Baki, Deku from My Hero Academia, Ichigo from Bleach, Chihiro from Kagurabachi, and Asta from Black Clover. Obviously, Killua and Zoro aren't MCs, but they're still important characters within their stories, and more importantly, I think they could fit well here for reasons we'll get into. If you're wondering why there's no JoJo characters here, well, I already covered them and the villains a while ago. You could check out those videos linked above, and also, no Naruto again, sorry, still haven't fully watched it. I'm very busy with Bleach and Black Clover right now. Almost done with both of those though. Anyways, just like the other videos I made like this one before, this is not an accurate power scaling video or a versus battle video, so don't go into here thinking that Goku is going to clear the entire verse because that's not what we're doing. I assume that was clear enough the last time with the My Hero Academia video, but I saw quite a few comments with people confused about that weirdly enough, so I'm clarifying that here. These are essentially brand new characters with different backstories and with completely different powers. Jujutsu-fied versions of them, if you will. It's meant to more look at their mindset, actions, and how their powers are translated into curse techniques. So don't go into this expecting me to say something like, well, Ichigo mogs the verse in terms of attack power and speed, because that's not the point. Especially because JJK is relatively weak compared to other series in general, but I digress. A lot of these characters would be top tiers by default. So there's a few things we need to go into. Curse techniques, curse tools if applicable, other abilities they'd have besides techniques, their mentality, and potential domain expansions or maximum techniques. Those domain expansions will be mostly hypothetical. We would cover grades for the characters, but the grading system in JJK has been shown time and time again to be an outdated standard, with many characters that could easily break through it with enough time. So I feel like grades are relatively arbitrary here, especially because I could just assign them whatever I want. And one last warning, expect JJK spoilers, as well as spoilers for the abilities of the characters in this video. The goal here is to not only see how they'd act as sorcerers, but give them unique abilities too. So instead of giving them just their entire movesets, we're going to take only part of what they're capable of, and give them something that fits as a curse technique. So in short, unique but inspired abilities that still fit this verse. So don't expect Goku to just be doing literally everything he does, because he does a lot. Speaking of him, let's start out with Kid Goku. I'm using Kid Goku here and not Adult Goku, because it fits way better. Not only because of what Goku's capable of at this point in his life, but also the fact that he's around the age Yuji is currently. Crafting a curse technique for him is interesting because of how much Goku can do. Having it act like just one technique is too restrictive, so it's not like we'll just give him a Kamehameha and call that a day. But on the other hand, we can't just say, oh, he's an alien that could transform and do dozens of different things, because, like, come on, that's overpowered, that's a cop-out. Let's take a middle ground, realistic approach. What I came up with is a curse technique called a curse energy projection. Goku's curse energy takes on different properties, acting basically like Ki does in Dragon Ball. He could charge it up in a variety of ways and project it as pure energy blast. It makes him a really powerful ranged fighter, but he could also power up his regular attacks. So not only can he reinforce himself like other people in this series, but he could be a lot more creative with how he uses his energy, given the ways he can manipulate and project it. I also had a really good idea for a curse tool that he could have, the Nyoibo, aka the Power Pole, a special grade curse tool that can extend endlessly as long as you don't see the end of it. Essentially, it works just like the chain of 1,000 miles that Toji used. As for other abilities, Goku of course has great martial arts experience, he has great curse energy control which basically comes with his technique innately. I don't know if he'd necessarily have any other abilities, maybe I'd say domain amplification right off the bat. In terms of his mentality, he'd be perfectly fine here. What he does in Dragon Ball is completely different than being a sorcerer of course, but I don't see him having to significantly change his ways to be a good sorcerer. In some ways he'd be pretty similar to Yuji too. He wouldn't have any issues with what he needs to do as a sorcerer, but at the same time, he would have to learn that curses are irredeemable. Even when faced with the fact that his actions may not amount to much, I don't think it would stop him, and he'd just push his way right through. Of course, he's motivated to become the strongest ever, so maybe his goal would be to surpass Gojo here. Or I guess Sukuna, if he's here in this situation. If he ever gets a domain expansion, I have two in mind, so I'll just explain both. And by the way, I've just basically come up with random names for these based on the series themselves. There's not really rhyme or reason, I just kind of chose what I thought was cool. First off, Wrath of the Dragon. It is an awesome name, and it fits, it's from the movie. This domain forces the enemy into a martial arts arena. The wrath that they're facing is Goku's. Since Goku enjoys his fights, I think this would be a non-lethal domain that would look like the World Tournament arena. It just enforces the rules. You can't leave unless you win the fight, which involves knocking the opponent out of the ring or knocking them unconscious. Killing isn't allowed, and if someone tries to kill in here, then the domain reflects that back onto them. This is really effective for non-lethally stopping opponents, and also makes fights more even. The second domain idea I had sounds pretty obvious. The Room of Spirit and Time. A domain where time flows differently, allowing Goku to use it for his own training or to fight without time passing on the outside. It seems vast, and the further you go into it, the more intense it gets. This one isn't too outlandish either because something like that already exists in JJK. You remember the sumo guy, Mio? Yep, his ability basically does this with sumo matches. Also, I guess the prison realm kind of counts too, given how time flows differently in there and just doesn't exist. Point being, I think it would be cool for Goku to have it, and there's a precedent for it. Next on to Fuuko. Her cursed technique is obviously going to be Unluck. In the simplest terms, her cursed energy alters luck. This would require contact to activate until she eventually figures out how to use it at a range, imbuing it within projectiles and other objects. Basically, she's anti-Hikari. I made a video about that too, check that out above. Anyways, for her cursed tools, she'd probably just have a regular revolver that she cursed with her Unluck, allowing her to shoot bullets that carry that Unluck. More like a regular revolver that she cursed, so technically a cursed tool in a way. Other abilities that would fit her are soul perception and soul attacks, just like Yuji has. I'm giving her that because that's what she does in her own series. Based on Undead Unluck, for her mentality, I think she might have a little bit of a rough start as a sorcerer, but definitely would be able to adapt given time. Like Yuta, for example, he was kind of a fish out of water, but he adjusted it and exactly understood his place in the world. That applies to her too, especially in Undead Unluck itself, and how she basically went from a random bystander nobody to now leading the Union and being the most important person in the story. Her domain would probably be something similar to Mahito's, guaranteeing a hit from her Unluck, so instead of it transfiguring your soul, by default this means you would get hit by Unluck. As for what it would look like or what it would be called, I'm kinda stumped as to what would fit for her. Maybe something akin to the Round Table. Next up, we have Gon Freecss. In Hunter x Hunter, Gon has a straightforward set of powers, and it's made very clear that enhancers are very straightforward people. So, he has a straightforward curse technique. We'll just call it enhancement. Gon's curse technique can enhance him to high levels, giving him immense physical power with limited projection of cursed energy through Jajanken. In a way, it's sorta similar to the technique we gave Goku, except Goku's is more focused at a range, while Gon's is more focused on physical enhancement. Basically, a way better version of cursed energy and reinforcement, beyond what most other people have access to. I don't see him having any cursed tools, but what the hell, let's give him his fishing rod. As for other abilities, well, he's good at hand-to-hand combat, he has great survival skills, and he has keen senses. And his keen senses relate to cursed energy too. He could even use this to see traces of it to track curses, and he could sense very small changes within cursed energy. This could be really useful during battle as well. Given what Gon went through as a hunter in Hunter x Hunter, if he existed in JJK instead, he would definitely have what it takes. He's shown that he has the resolve needed to be a hunter, and that would apply to being a sorcerer as well. Sure, he could be a bit stubborn at times, and maybe even a bit rash in some cases, but I think he could definitely overcome these flaws. Would it be easy? Definitely not. Could he get through it? With enough perseverance? Yeah, I think he has what it takes. His technique doesn't really fit a domain, so I'm going to cover a maximum technique instead, just so we at least can give him something. His maximum technique will just be Adult Gon. Gon can manifest all the power that he'll have in his life at his peak, granting him immense strength at a moment's notice. The aura and presence of this form is also incredibly intimidating as is, but besides that, the physical power is immense. The downside is this puts him out of commission for a bit after the fact, so he can't just use it whenever he wants. I did consider making this some sort of binding vow because that also really fits as that. Honestly, even better than a maximum technique, but considering he's kinda getting screwed by not having a domain here, I'm throwing him a bone so that he could use this more than once. I'm actually more interested in covering Killua though, because I think he fits really well in this verse. Of course, his cursed technique would be electricity related, and we'll just call it electricity. His cursed energy has the properties of electricity, and he fights pretty much like he does in Hunter x Hunter. He could charge himself with real electricity, and convert it into cursed energy. Sounds familiar? Yeah. Just like Yuji is related to Sukuna, we could say Killua was kind of like that with Kashimo instead. And even more fitting, the Zoldyck clan. They're a clan of sorcerers here. Unlike Kashimo, his innate power wouldn't be Mythical Beast Amber, it would probably be a maximum technique akin to Godspeed, with the downside being the fact that it runs through electricity quickly. As a cursed tool, kind of like Gon, I couldn't think of a specific cursed tool, but he probably would just carry his regular yo-yo. Or maybe like a special cursed yo-yo. That sounds kind of goofy, I don't know how that would work, but hey, he made a yo-yo cool in Hunter x Hunter, so it would probably be cool here. Killua is just the goat like that. As for other abilities, if we're assuming he's the member of some sorcerer clan like the Zoldyck clan, and that the Zoldyck clan is just as notable here as they are in Hunter x Hunter, then he'd probably be a really proficient fighter all around. He'd have assassination techniques and a fighting style of an assassin. He'd have control of his joints, he'd have claws, he'd have weapon mastery, he'd have a tolerance for poison and electricity immunity, the latter being because of his cursed technique, but he also had a tolerance for that in Hunter x Hunter anyways. With his technique, he'd also have immense speed, and I don't know if he'd have a simple domain right away, but I feel like he could definitely achieve something similar to it. Look at what he did in the Chimera Ant arc with the darts game. He was able to predict and quickly counterattacks coming his way, so it feels kind of fitting here. As for his mentality, he'd definitely have no issues being a sorcerer. His whole thing would probably be becoming more human. As for his domain, I couldn't really think of a fitting name without the risk of sounding like I'm trying too hard, so it's named after one of his techniques in Hunter x Hunter. Feel free to comment another name below, but the placeholder name here is Lightning Whirlwind, a domain with virtually endless electricity for Killua to absorb and utilize. He could use this to recharge his cursed energy, but since it's electricity, he still does need to convert it, so it's not like Hikari where he has infinite energy. If it were like that, well, he'd be overpowered as hell, essentially Hikari and Kashimo together. With the energy being endless in here, his Godspeed is constantly active. Killua is basically untouchable to most opponents, and they also become electrically charged. So on top of the guaranteed hits, he could use this charge for homing attacks, which wouldn't be completely unavoidable, but they'd be really hard to avoid given the speed. Next up, we'll go to Luffy. His cursed technique is pretty obvious, just rubber. His cursed energy has the properties of rubber, and this applies to his body too. When he fortifies himself with cursed energy, that gives him the properties of rubber, so he could stretch himself or make other things work like rubber. He never really works with any cursed tools, and as for other abilities, in place of a simple domain or domain amplification, he would probably find ways to utilize his rubber in order to make it work like those techniques. As for mentality, well, I feel like Luffy definitely has the mental fortitude to be a sorcerer, as well as the perseverance for it. He probably would be one of the few people to also despise the higher-ups and wouldn't follow along with their guidelines, so he and Gojo at least share that. As for his domain, I base it on Gear 5th and his awakening. We'll just refer to it as Nika's liberation. In this domain, Luffy is completely liberated, and even the domain itself is made of rubber. It's represented by a vast ocean, with the totem of the domain being a pirate ship. Everything in here succumbs to Luffy's freedom and laughter, giving it an almost cartoonish type effect. I wonder what Takaba would think about this. Since we just covered Luffy, let's go on to Zoro next. As for cursed technique, he has none. Given the fact that he doesn't have any specific devil fruit power or whatnot, maybe he'd be like Kusakabe here in the sense that he's an insanely good swordsman without an innate technique. I feel like even without a cursed technique, he'd be really versatile. You might think I should give him a cursed technique akin to Haki or something, but even without that, he can accomplish a lot of the same things regular Haki could do with insane cursed energy control. Still different, of course, and he misses out on some of the advanced Haki things, but from a very basic point of view, he can still pull off pretty similar things. Like if he has an advanced level of reinforcement, for example, that replaces Armament Haki, or maybe his cursed energy is so intense that it basically replaces Conqueror's Haki and works the same way. And maybe Simple Domain could work as a replacement for Observation Haki, since the only thing I could think of that's closest to that is the Six Eyes, which obviously isn't a technique and obviously works very differently too. Not like we could just apply that to Zoro. Although with everything I just mentioned about Haki, I guess we could apply some of the same things to Luffy, but more so to Zoro because that's going to be his only focus here without a cursed technique. So while he lacks an innate technique, he possesses all of those other things, and he has other good abilities too. He'd probably find some way to pull off a 3-sword style here, and he might even find unique ways to use binding vows for himself. Maybe not Sukuna level where he could just spam them, but I'm sure he'll find good workarounds. Obviously he works with various swords here as cursed tools, and they're pretty easy to translate over, like Enma for example, a sword that just draws out insane amounts of cursed energy, basically becoming an overpowered extension of the user. As for motivation, Zoro is incredibly driven to be the strongest swordsman in history, and has learned any technique that could help a sorcerer like himself. Because in this verse, if he wants to be the strongest swordsman, he has to be a powerful sorcerer. And in terms of being a sorcerer, he'd definitely be loyal to those around him, particularly whoever he's working with, I guess that being Luffy here. He wouldn't really have an issue with taking on curses or even feeling as if he's a cog. He'd carve his own path, and he'd be heavily motivated along the way. And it goes without saying, he doesn't have a domain expansion. Knowing him, if he had his own domain, he'd probably find a way to get lost in it. Next on to Baki. His technique is visualization. Baki can manifest spirits through different fighting styles. For example, he could take on the stance of an animal, and it'll appear behind him. As for his strongest visualization, it's when he imagines a demon, represented by his back. It's somewhat akin to what Megumi could do, or I guess Ino in a sense with his seancing. Baki wouldn't be using any cursed tools either, he just fights with his body. And as for other abilities, well, martial arts. He's obviously a very physical focused fighter. This version of Baki seeks to grow as strong as possible, I mean, kinda like normal, and that applies to a lot of the MCs here because it's just a very common motivation, but obviously Baki's motivation from the main series applies here too. I guess here he just want to be the strongest sorcerer possible, and if there were some sort of Yujiro in this hypothetical universe, then that of course would be the person he's trying to surpass. If not him, then someone like Gojo or Sukuna if he somehow manages to get free. For a domain, I use the alternate name for the underground arena, which is the Holy Land of Fighting. Baki's visualization in this domain reaches new heights. He could visualize the opponent in perfect detail, analyzing their weak points and what they're capable of. Baki can use this to mimic his opponents or overwhelm them through prediction. So beyond the regular Beast Team manifest, he could essentially manifest another person. And this is also good for training too because he could pop a domain and fight against someone like that. So not only would he use this in battle, he'd probably use it outside of battle as well, fighting whatever animals or people he visualizes. Following him we have Deku. I had to get more creative with him considering the variety of different quirks he has, so we'll try to build a kit that fits most of them. Instead of just giving him one for all, or all of his abilities at once, this feels like a unique workaround that's also fitting for the verse, something that we're aiming for. His curse technique is Fajin. It works pretty much as it does in the main series. Alright, so what about his other quirks? Well, for Black Whip, we'll represent it with a cursed tool, the Black Rope, assuming he gets his hands on one. I don't know, it sounded funny in my head. Black Whip, Black Rope, I thought it was funny. And we could use other abilities to represent his other quirks. These would all take time to develop, but Deku could likely do so. Fortification somewhat represents One for All as a way to buff him physically. Everyone could use this anyways, so it's not unlikely that he'd have it. Actually, it's basically guaranteed, it kinda goes without saying. Gear Shift can be represented by Domain Amplification. Gear Shift changes how he accelerates through space, while Domain Amplification changes how he pushes through other curse techniques. Simple Domain, on the other hand, represents Danger Sense. Not exactly the same, of course, but it's the most fitting substitute I could think of for defensive measures. Instead of float, there are ways to walk on air like Sukuna and Maki did. Now, this one's kind of a stretch because, first of all, it's pretty rare, and the only two people who did it are basically masters of their craft. It's really the only thing I can think of that could replace it, besides making his actual curse technique float, which would be kind of underpowered. On its own, it probably wouldn't work too well. This one would probably take the most time to develop, if he even does. His mentality might not fit too well with being a sorcerer at first, but then again, Yuji also had a very idealistic view of it. Deku is selfless to a fault. In the world of JJK, that's actually kind of a bad thing. Although Yuji's challenging that notion, so Deku probably would too. More importantly, Deku does aim to save people, and it's not like being a hero is all rainbows and sunshine, so he could probably adjust to being a sorcerer too, especially with his desire to save others pushing him along the way. Exercising curses probably won't be an issue, but I'd wonder how he'd handle fighting other people, given his desire to save everybody, which definitely won't be possible for some of the people here. His domain has a pretty straightforward name, Plus Ultra, a space where Deku can constantly build up energy with his technique and reach insane speeds with a devastating guaranteed hit. Essentially, he can combine everything at once in here, and with the speeds he can achieve, he's nearly untouchable. Since we haven't included Smokescreen, I guess a way to include it would make the domain have this as an ambient effect. You know, it has smoke everywhere just to obscure him, and it gives him an advantage as well. Let me know below if you could think of any other techniques in this series that could replace his quirks, but I feel like those are the ones that fit closest to it, even if all of them aren't perfect substitutes. Ichigo's next, and I am still reading through Bleach, but I'm loving it so far. So just like in my Hero Academia video, keep in mind I'm just basing this off of how far I'm into the series. If you could think of a more fitting power for Ichigo, go ahead and comment below. The curse technique I thought of is cursification. Sounds like a really stupid word, but hear me out. Taking inspiration from holification, and partially how being a Soul Reaper works in general, why not make Ichigo do something similar? He can gain additional power by taking on the properties of a cursed spirit, while still being a human sorcerer. I feel like this one is unique, and it fits both the character and the verse as a whole, so he stands out while at the same time fitting in. To make this useful, this power lets him transform and gives him a few things. A power boost, regeneration without reverse curse technique, soul perception, and the ability to use cursed energy as energy blasts like the Finger Bearer. The downside is that he has to leave his body to do this, and he's vulnerable to positive energy like any other regular spirit. This way he has abilities similar to the regular Ichigo, and abilities similar to cursed spirits, with fitting trade-offs. As a cursed tool, obviously Zangetsu. This will be a tool unique to him, manifested in his cursed form. All those powers I mentioned, like energy projection for example, those could be channeled through his sword. I did think the Soul Split Katana might be fitting too, but it's not like it's easy to obtain, and he's broken as is. I feel like any ability from Bleach that we could translate over to JJK would be overpowered in general. Like, not even in the sense of raw power, I mean just how they work on a technical level and what their effects are. Anyways, for other abilities, well, he's a great swordsman, so it's probably fitting for him to work under Kusakabe and learn abilities from him. So we definitely have a bunch of different sword drawing techniques, like a lot of other people in this video, simple domain. Ichigo also has martial arts experience, so why not give him that here too. Zangetsu also kinda works like Hazy Moon here, so that's another interesting addition, I guess. And he might even get reverse curse technique down the line, given the fact he understands regen when he's a spirit, so maybe he'd find out a way to do that as a human. And his mentality's pretty straightforward, he wants to save others. Same for his domain too, because both domains and bankais reflect characters' identities, so this would be a perfect shoe-in for his domain's abilities. It's essentially the same, with a guaranteed hit. And oh look, another swordsman, Chihiro from Kagurabachi. If you haven't already read the series, I recommend it heavily. But he feels like kind of a shoe-in because he's not just a regular swordsman, he also has some other fitting abilities here. For his curse technique, I'll call it tool amplification. He normally fights with a sword, but for any tool that he holds, he could draw out its power even further and make it his own curse technique. We'll use N10's abilities as an example, the sword he carries in the main series. So with this sword, he could summon the powers from it, amplifying the sword and making its powers his own. There's Kuro, which affects the sword's attacks, Akka, which could defend, reflect, and temporarily copy, and Nishiki, a cloak that enhances his abilities. This is a really potent technique, especially if he gets a strong tool. However, his knowledge and familiarity with the tool changes the effectiveness of this. N10, for example, is a Rokuhira blade, and the main one he'll use here, so he has perfect control of it. But if we give him a random tool like Nanami's, for example, he could use it, but he won't have perfect knowledge of it. For other abilities, well, pretty much any other swordsman ability that I just covered. Weapons mastery tool, primarily with swords. For mentality, well, I know a lot of you probably haven't read this yet, so he might seem pretty generic and edgy on the surface, but he's a pretty empathetic guy. Actually, if you haven't read the series yet, I'll link my video above, but I'll give a quick breakdown here. Essentially, he's losing the I don't give a fuck war. He has a seemingly cold exterior, but he's pretty compassionate. I don't know how much that'll affect him as a sorcerer, because he clearly is capable of getting the job done and killing if he needs to, but he likely will grow attached to people around him. Other than that, he's perfect for being a sorcerer. He could definitely fit well here. His domain expansion is Sazanami's Storehouse. Again, for those who haven't read the story, in the most recent arc, he fought a clan of sorcerers that could access a storehouse in a separate dimension. This isn't his ability in the actual story, but his friend has access to the storehouse and can also transport things to and from it. So even though it's not his, it's kind of perfect for a domain expansion here. This could be a place where he keeps all of his swords, and it acts kind of like how Megumi could store his weapons in shadows. He could access his domain outside of battle and add tools to it, and in the domain he could apply the sure hit to any one tool. The domain allows him to swap out weapons based on the opponent, and he can even store other things in there too. Last but not least, Asta. His curse technique is purification. Since he's known for anti-magic, here it would be whatever the antithesis to cursed energy is, so I guess that means he has to generate some sort of positive energy. His power would likely be akin to Jacob's Ladder or even something like Maharaga's Sword of Extermination. He can manifest this energy in multiple ways, usually through a sword, and it can completely nullify cursed techniques or energy through contact. And with him having positive energy by default, that means he would likely have reverse curse technique by default, since that's based on using positive energy. As for how it works, simply put, it'll just work like his anti-magic in Black Clover. The way he summons it and uses weapons for it could be the exact same as normal. And since he negates cursed energy, he probably won't be using cursed tools. They're basically off limits for him and useless in his hands. Instead, he'll use his own weapons that he manifests from his energy. And on a similar note, his regular abilities would kind of work like domain amplification in a sense. So that's worth noting too. For his mentality and motivation, instead of becoming a Wizard King, I guess his motivation here would be becoming the strongest sorcerer in history. And again, his ability kind of fits really well for this verse. So a lot of his same mentality there would apply here too, especially with how he uses his power. Like, his curse technique is really potent, but it just nullifies other powers. He'd have to focus a lot on his own physical strength too. That's definitely important here. As for domain expansion, I just called it Flaw of the World. A non-lethal domain where all cursed energy is completely nullified, whether negative or positive. It's an incredibly unique domain, especially because it's all positive energy. In here, it's basically a test of physical strength, and it's kind of rigged in Asta's favor given how strong he is physically. Given the complete nullification of cursed energy, it's kind of hard to break out of and into. But it's also technically non-lethal and just enforces a powerful rule. The sure hit is the nullification itself. And that basically covers everyone, so who do you think would be the most successful on this list? Do you think any of their abilities will work differently? Comment all of that below. I'd like to see what you think. And more importantly, do you think any of them have the potential to be a greater sorcerer than Yuji? As usual, thank you all for watching, and be sure to subscribe if you want to see more like this. I'll see you all in my next video.